So this morning I've been asked by Heather and the board to talk with you for about an hour about the upcoming provincial election. We've heard a lot about the election, people talk about it all the time, but if you pick up the newspaper, as you did yesterday perhaps, and you may have noticed, the story that you often get in the mainstream media is a story that's told through a particular lens. It's an employer lens, and frankly it's very often a conservative lens. But what I plan to do today is talk about issues related to the election from the lens of working people and the unions that represent them. So to provide that context that we all need to make an informed decision in the upcoming election whenever it's held, we need to ask a lot of questions. So this morning I could talk about the fact that the United Conservative Party is proposing to balance budgets going forward by cutting spending on public services by as much as 20%, which, by the way, would represent a bigger cut than what we saw during the Klein years. But I'm not going to do that. I could also talk about how Jason Kenney and the UCP are talking about reanimating the zombie of private healthcare, which we had buried 20 years ago, we thought was still dead. But it's come back to life, and now we have to deal with the conversation about how to protect our public healthcare system. So I could talk about privatization in healthcare, but I won't do that either. Instead, I'm going to spend most of the next hour talking about the issue that Albertans have identified as the biggest issue going into the election, and that is the issue of the economy. And to illustrate why this issue has risen to the top, and this is what we're being told by individuals when I travel around the province talking to our members, when you look at public opinion polls that have been released by news organizations and others over the last 6 months, the economy is number one. And just to illustrate why, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. So this is the audience participation segment. How many of you in this audience have ever yourselves worked in the oil and gas sector? Okay, so a few. Keep your hands up, please. How many of you in this audience have a husband or a partner who works in the oil and gas industry? Okay, keep your hands up. How many of you have a husband or partner who ever worked in the oil and gas industry? Okay, how many of you have a child or a relative who works in the oil and gas industry? Okay, so this is not unusual. What I'm guessing is about 75% of the crowd have their hands up in one way or another. And this confirms what we all know. We live in a province that is an oil and gas jurisdiction. And so when we talk about the economy, what we're really talking about is the oil and gas industry. And so what we've been hearing, and what I've been hearing as I tour the province talking to our members in both public and private sector unions, is that they're profoundly concerned. There's a sense of anxiety and in many cases a sense of fear about what's going on in our economy, what it means for the future of our economy, and what it means for our jobs and the jobs of people we care about. And that concern and that anxiety is so high that there are a lot of people who are willing to say, well, I don't like Jason Kenney and the UCP. I don't like his social values. I don't like his plans for healthcare. I don't like his plans for education. And I don't like it when he talks about cutting support for public services. But I'm going to hold my nose and vote for him because of the economy. And I'm not going to ask how many people might be thinking that in this room. Suffice it to say that I know it's some of you. So this presentation is actually for you, okay? So you guys are health professionals, and so I think everyone would agree that if you were treating a patient with an ailment, the most important thing is to get the right diagnosis. If you get the wrong diagnosis, you might get the wrong treatment, and if you get the wrong treatment, you could actually make the patient worse, not better. The same is true with the economy. And the same is true with the economy related to oil and gas. So over the next half hour or 45 minutes, I want to begin by walking you through a diagnosis of what is actually happening in the Alberta oil and gas economy through a labor lens. Okay, so you've heard the diagnosis through the business media lens and through the employer lens, But we in the labor movement, especially through the Federation, like, we represent public sector workers like yourselves, but we also represent people who work in oil and gas. And so it's part of our job to understand the economy that these people work in and the economy that affects all of us in this province. And so we've been doing that. And we have come to the conclusion that, that the patient, the economy, is ailing, but perhaps not for the reasons that we've all been told. And in fact, we would go so far as to say, based on our research and our understanding of the oil and gas economy, that something unprecedented is happening in global oil and gas markets. And it's something that Albertans, because we live in an oil and gas producing jurisdiction, we have to know. Because if we don't know, we won't have the information that we need to cast an informed vote in the next election. So we've coined a term at the Federation of Labor, and that term is energy transformation. What we're experiencing right now here in Alberta is the result of an energy transformation. On the surface, it feels like what we've seen before, because we're a commodity producing jurisdiction, and we're used to the roller coaster of booms and busts. But what we're experiencing today is not just another boom and bust, and we can't do what Albertans and Alberta governments have done in the past, which is simply to wait for the next boom. You guys remember the bumper sticker from the 80s, right? For the older of us among the crowd, I remember it. The bumper sticker that said, "God, please give us another boom, we won't piss it away next time," right? That was the big bumper sticker that was on everyone's bumpers back in the 1980s when the oil price collapsed. And that actually has been the operating principle for governments in this province since oil was discovered here. It's like, okay, things are great when the price of oil is high, things are awful when the price of oil is down. And so we're used to that roller coaster. But what I'm here to tell you today is that this is not a boom and bust. It's a fundamental transformation, and I want to tell you about it. And I think it's something that all Albertans should know, especially leading up to the next election. So the energy transformation, as we define it, has three dimensions. And the first dimension has to do with our friendly neighbor south of the border, the United States. So this chart shows oil production from the United States going back to 2010, so less than 10 years. And what you can see by looking at this chart is that oil production from the United States has been transformed. 8 years ago, only 8 years ago, in 2010, the United States was producing an average of about 5.5 million barrels of oil a day. So just only a little bit more than we in Canada produce. We produce about 4 million barrels of oil per day. But over the course of 8 short years, the United States went from producing 5.5 million barrels of oil today to nearly 12 million barrels of oil today. This is the result of new technologies. Ironically, technologies that were actually developed here in Alberta, but they were put to use most aggressively in places like Texas. And I'm going to tell you the names of the technology. You've all heard them, and even if you don't work in the oil and gas industry, you've heard the names. For the purpose of our presentation, you don't have to understand the technology, just know that it's new technology. Fracking and horizontal drilling. Okay, those two technologies put together have unlocked a bonanza of production from formations, especially in Texas, that people thought were depleted. So you might have heard of the Permian Basin. Okay, that's basically all of Texas, and it was what made Texas Texas, right? So all those stories about oil production in Texas in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it turned Texas into the oil capital of the world. They thought that those formations were tapped out, but that because of this new technology, they were able to squeeze more oil out. So that new technology has transformed production in the United States. Now, why is that significant for Alberta? And why do we identify this as the first dimension of the global oil and gas transformation? The reason that this is transformative is because this increase in production was so great and happened over such a short period of time that it upset the global supply-demand balance for oil. So the world consumes about 100 million barrels of oil a day, and so they basically added another 10 million, another 10% to global supply in less than 10 years. And so, and if that wasn't bad enough, I want you to, so this upset the global oil supply and demand balance, and Economics 101 tells you when you have more supply than demand, what happens? Price goes down, okay? And that would have been bad enough as it is, but it's particularly bad for Alberta for a number of other reasons. And the first has to do with who we sell to. Now, I think most people know, if you've been following the media at all, that the United States is our biggest customer. But I'm not sure that people realize how much that is the case. Okay, so I'm going to ask this question. Of the oil that we as Albertans produce and export internationally, what proportion of that oil goes to the United States? 75%? 90%? It is actually 99%. 99% of the oil that we export goes to this market that has been transformed by production. Now, I see people's eyes widening, and that is actually exactly the right reaction, because our customer, our biggest customer, in fact, literally our only customer, has become essentially self-sufficient in oil. And that's a big challenge for us. And that's one of the reasons that people are talking about, hey, we have to find new markets, right? And when people say that, it's true, but it's only part of the story. The other part of the story, and this is what happened when production went up, okay? The other piece of the puzzle, which you probably heard about, but you might not have understood in the context, is that when American oil production was going up, this got the attention of some other people in the world, most notably the big oil producers in the world, and most notably Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was the #1 oil producer in the world, and they felt these American tight oil producers, that's what they call them, shale oil, tight oil, the fracked oil. They felt them nipping at their heels, and they wanted to put them in their place. And so what did the Saudis do in response to the explosion of American production? They turned up the taps too. So prices were already falling because of the American production upsetting the global supply and demand balance. The Saudis heaped more production on top of that in a very conscious effort to drive prices down further. And their hope was that because the cost per barrel of producing oil from Texas was higher than Saudi Arabia, they thought they could drive the Americans out of business, okay? And so this is what happened to the price. So this all happened between 2014 and 2015, and this is 2015. So the price of oil went from nearly $120 a barrel down to $35 a barrel in 6 months because of overproduction by the US, compounded by overproduction, deliberate overproduction by the Saudis. It was a catastrophe in terms of the price of oil, from $120 a barrel to $35 a barrel in 6 months. And guess when the New Democrats were elected? Right here. We had actually already fallen off the cliff in terms of oil prices. It started in January of 2015, but we were in free fall when the New Democrats were elected in 2015. So this chart is a chart of what happens to oil investment when prices go down. And this is what some analysts call the iron law of oil investment. Oil investment follows price. It's pretty much as simple as that. It doesn't have to do with taxes, it doesn't have to do with policies, it doesn't have to do with regulation. When the price of oil goes up, oil companies invest in exploration and development. When the price of oil goes down, they invest less. And so this is a chart going back to 1980 on the left-hand side, and the price of crude is the dark blue line, and the real oil and gas investment is the light blue line, and you see that they march in lockstep. So when people tell you that the drop in investment in Alberta is the result of the New Democrats, or it's the result of Justin Trudeau, or it's the result of, people like to point fingers, and it's not. It's simply because of these production factors, the overproduction, the gluts led to price drops, which inevitably led to a drop in investment. And just to zoom in on oil investment, this is global oil investment. And once again, this illustrates the point that it's not just Alberta. This is global oil investment, so all the oil companies around the world. And what you see is that when when production went up, prices fell, investment fell by 25% between 2014 and 2015, and by another 26% between 2015 and 2016. So more than a 50% drop in investment in oil and gas over the course of about a year, and then it flattened out, and investment has remained at this much lower level to this day. Okay. And here's a chart with investment in the United States. So you've probably heard, oh, investment is fleeing Alberta for other jurisdictions. How many people have heard that? And assume that it's true, okay? You know, there's you guys have all heard of Stephen Colbert, the late night host, right? Yes. And he has this term that he uses, that he used to use, and it's called truthiness. He says it's a political argument that may not be true, but it sounds like it's true, and people don't have time to check, so they accept it as true, okay? This idea that oil investment is fleeing Alberta for other jurisdictions is an example of truthiness, okay? It sounds like it might be true, and it serves certain political narratives, but it is not true. So what this chart shows is oil investment in the United States, and the blue lines are 2014, so this is by quarter, first, second, third, fourth quarter. Blue line is 2014 when prices were still high, and then the other lines are the quarterly investments in the subsequent years. So 2015, 2016, 2017, and 2018. And what you'll see is that the drop in investment was consistent with what was happening around the world. So global oil investment dropped by 50% all around the world, and it also dropped by 50% even in the United States. So they set off this problem by implementing all these new technologies to drive our production, but they struggled with the results themselves. Similarly, you've probably heard, it's the NDP policies in Alberta driving investment away, and it's going to not only Texas, but also Saskatchewan. This chart shows what happened to oil investment in Saskatchewan compared to Alberta. The orange line is Alberta, appropriately. The blue line is Saskatchewan, run by a Conservative government, so I suppose that's appropriate. The red line is Canada. And this is the amount, the proportion of investment that dropped every year, 2015, 16, and 17. And you can see that the blue and the orange lines, that's Saskatchewan and Alberta, the drop in investments were almost exactly the same, and for exactly the same reasons. The price of oil went down, so companies responded by reducing investment. So that's the first dimension of the energy transformation as we define it. The second dimension of the energy transformation has to do with the way companies responded to this new low price environment. Okay, so what do companies do when they're pressured? They try to cut costs, right? And how do they cut costs? As working people, we know how they cut costs. They start cutting costs by cutting people. And in response to this unprecedented drop in the price of oil, which was coming at the same time as an unprecedented drop in investment, companies responded in another unprecedented fashion. They introduced automation to replace people at a rate we have never seen. So in the course of 5 or 6 short years, the global oil industry has been transformed, and it's been a transformation in employment driven by automation. So the news story that I have here tells one of those stories which you may have heard about, and it is close to home for us. And it talks about how Suncor, which is the biggest Canadian oil company, has responded to the drop in prices by automating away jobs in their facilities up in Fort McMurray. So the story is about driverless trucks. And so when you think of the oil sands, what do you think of? You think of the iconic image, right, of the heavy haul truck. That's the quintessential Fort McMurray job, driving the heavy haul truck to take the mined bitumen to the upgrader, right? And these are unionized jobs, and they were piloting. They were doing a pilot on driverless trucks. They had about 12 or 14 of them before the price of oil collapsed. As soon as the price of oil collapsed, they decided that they were going to transform it from a pilot to basically take all the jobs. So within the next couple of years, virtually all the heavy haul trucks will be automated. This is hundreds of jobs lost, both the drivers and the maintenance people, because the automated trucks don't need as much maintenance. And the final tidbit, which I'll leave you with, every single new truck that has been bought at Suncor and every other oil sands mine in Fort McMurray right now, even if it's being driven by a real life person right now, they've all been designed to be able to be converted over to be driverless. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. So it's not just the oil sands, it's all across the oil and gas industry, including drilling, oil field service. You know, some of you, like, even if you haven't worked in the oil and gas industry yourself, you've probably seen drilling trucks driving up and down the highways, like precision drilling, ensign drilling, you've seen the names, right? The new generation of drilling platforms, the old generation used to require between 12 and 20 people to operate. The new generation, two people, okay? So that's what's happened with and that's the second dimension of the oil and gas transformation. And to see how this plays out, and once again, and it's not just an Alberta issue, I want to show you some numbers on jobs, okay? What did this mean to jobs in Alberta oil and gas sector? And just for reference, I want to compare it to Texas, okay? So this is Alberta, and the reason Alberta's way down at the bottom is because more people work in Texas. It's a bigger economy, and you'll see in a minute. But the trend was that we went from about 178,000 Albertans working in the oil and gas industry in 2014. By 2016, we had lost about 60,000 of those jobs. About 22% of those have come back, but we lost a lot of jobs in oil and gas. Now, for those who say that Texas is different and it's so much better in Texas, look at this. These are the oil, and this is at the same time that their production is going through the roof. Like you saw the chart, right? The production is going through the roof, but at the very same time that the production is going through the roof, they lost 150,000 jobs. And fewer of those, as a proportion of those jobs, fewer of them have come back than in Alberta, okay? So they lost we lost about 50,000 jobs, they lost about 150,000 jobs. It's the same trend for the same reasons. Drop in price, drop in investment, automation. These things led to a collapse in employment and economic activity in every oil producing jurisdiction in the world. It's not just Alberta. So there are two final factors that I want to talk about that have influenced what we're experiencing here in Alberta. The first is Alberta specific, and the second is global. So the Alberta specific dimension of this energy transformation has to do with pipelines. Okay, now, and I think it's interesting, I deliberately left pipelines to this point because this is the appropriate place to talk about it. After you understand about everything else that's happened, we can start talking about pipelines. But unfortunately, when we have conversations about the oil industry in Alberta, this is where we start. So it's an important point, but it's not the only point. So what does this slide show? Well, there's two things going on here. The black line shows oil production in Alberta, which, by the way, 85% of our oil comes from the oil sands. Only 15% comes from, conventional or fracked oil. But what you see when you look at the line for production is that just like Texas, despite the drop in price, despite the drop in investment, despite the drop in jobs, production continued its march upward. With one small glitch. You see it right here? You know what that is? That's the Fort McMurray fires, right there. Okay. And I know some of you actually had to live through that, but this is what happened when the fires threatened the oil sands facilities, and some of them actually had to shut down production for months, right? But other than that, production was on this onward march. So the black line is production. The shaded areas are what people in the industry call takeaway capacity. So these are the barrels that we can take away in our pipeline system. The big gray one, which is most important, but people don't ever talk about, is what they call the Enbridge main line. This is the pipeline. This is our oldest pipeline system. It still takes away most of our oil, almost all to the American Midwest. So that's the big pipeline network, and then there's some smaller ones like the First Keystone, the Express Pipeline, the Aurora Rangeland Pipeline, but all together, this is total takeaway capacity. And what you'll see, if you look over here right at the corner of the chart, and this is from the National Energy Board, which is the National Energy Regulator. They produced this in December. Right here, you'll see that production exceeds takeaway capacity, okay? So this is right before Christmas. You guys, if you're an Albertan and you're not living under a rock, you heard about this in the news. And this is when people say we need new pipelines. This is the reason, okay? So we actually, as of October of 2018, our production exceeded our takeaway capacity. Now, what happens? This is what happened. This is the price of what we call Western Canadian Select, which is the benchmark price for diluted bitumen. So once again, 85% of our oil is heavy oil, diluted bitumen. This is what we call it, Western Canadian Select. And it always trades at a discount to other grades of oil because it's heavier, it needs to be processed more, and we also have to transport it further, right? So it always trades at a discount. Don't let anyone ever tell you that we're gonna get world price for our oil. Unless you have like a Star Trek transporter, it's not gonna happen. But it always traded between $15 and $20 discount. But the differential, and we've all heard that word, expanded when we filled up our pipelines. And it wasn't just that the differential expanded, the price of oil collapsed. And I want to put the price collapse in context for you, okay? Here's the price of oil in September. Here's the price of oil in October when the pipelines filled up. For several days, our bitumen was trading on the spot markets at negative prices. We couldn't give away his stuff, right? So the government, the Notley government, responded after the hair was on fire. After they put their hair on fire, put the fire out on their hair. They sat down with industry and said, what we're going to do about this, and they all agreed on what they call curtailment, right? So they imposed production caps of 8% of production so that the pipelines would no longer be filled up. So when people talk about curtailment, it was an emergency measure to make sure that the pipelines would not be filled up. And it worked like a charm. The price of oil went, in the course of like 3 days, as soon as that was announced, the price of oil went back up because the futures traders were satisfied that the problem had been dealt with, at least for the time being. So that leads us to the final dimension of the energy transformation, and I would argue that the biggest. And I've been talking about a lot of big stuff, okay? And so I want to put this last point in context, okay? So everything we talked about is really serious. This is more serious, okay? So the final dimension of the energy transformation, which is affecting our oil economy and all oil economies around the world, has to do with demand, okay? So the chart I'm going to show you is from an organization called the Energy Information Administration, which is basically the US Energy Department. But these projections about future demand are very similar to the projections that you hear from basically any other forecasting agency in the world. This is one of the gold standard organizations in terms of energy forecasting, and it's one used by industry itself to make decisions about future investment, okay? So every year they produce a forecast of how much oil they think the world is going to consume. And that's a big deal for oil producing jurisdictions like us because it's what we use to make our investment decisions on, and the oil companies make the investment decisions. So they do 3 scenarios. The first scenario is what they call current policies, and we're actually about here. So the world consumes almost 100 million barrels of oil a day, and basically they say if nothing changes, the world will continue to increase their consumption of oil for the next 20 years at a rate of about 2% a year. So between now and 2040, if nothing changes, the world will consume 120 million barrels of oil a day. And that's kind of healthy. You can sustain an industry on 2% growth a year, okay? And if you read the business pages, and if you listen to some of the CEOs of oil companies in Calgary, when they project what the future is going to look like, this is all they say. They never mention the other scenarios. But we think it's irresponsible not to consider the other scenarios. So what are they? The second scenario is what they call the new policy scenario. And this is a scenario that takes into account policy decisions that have already been made by industry and government but have not yet been implemented. Okay, so as it stands right now, there's 75 countries in the world that have implemented some form of carbon pricing, okay, which is a lot. And some of them are just implementing them now, and that will have an effect on consumption. So they factor that in and they say, okay, so they've already agreed to these things, they're being implemented, what will that mean for demand? Well, it means that demand will be almost flat. It'll go from 100 million barrels a day to 106. So instead of having 2% growth a year, it's more like 0.2% growth a year, okay? The third scenario that they envision is what they call a sustainable development scenario. And this scenario says, what is world demand for oil going to look like if the world actually gets serious about climate change? If they start living up to the commitments that they made under the Paris Accord, which was an international agreement designed to help the world deal with the problem of climate change. And I'll just point out that is an agreement that was signed by every nation in the world except for Nicaragua, which didn't think we went far enough, Syria, which was basically a dysfunctioning state, and Donald Trump's United States. Everyone else signed it. Everyone else signed it. And so if the world actually implements the Paris Accord and reaches the targets that they've set, this is what happens to demand for what we sell. Demand under this scenario will peak not in 10 years, not in 20 years, but in 6 years, okay? And then it will fall to 70 million barrels a day. So that's a decline of 30% in 20 years for the thing that we sell. And so what we're saying as a labor movement, the movement that represents working people in an oil-producing jurisdiction, we're saying it's irresponsible to ignore the sustainable development scenario and what it might mean for jobs and investment. So why do we say that we have to pay attention to the sustainability scenario? Well, there's a number of reasons, but the biggest one is that the world is finally waking up to climate change. So in some ways, it doesn't matter what we think here in Alberta. So I'm not trying to convince anyone in this room or any other room about the truth of climate change. I'm just telling you what the rest of the world is doing. And the rest of the world are our customers. And 2018 was a very important year in terms of climate change and the way the world is responding to it. It was a year characterized by biblical floods, record heat waves that killed literally tens of thousands of people, not just in places like Pakistan, where in the summer the temperature went up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit for weeks on end. There were heat waves in places like Montreal that killed people. And then wildfires in Australia, in California. And you guys remember what our skies looked like over the summer last year. We have scientists telling us that we better get used to that because it's going to happen not every 5 years, every 7 years like it used to. It's going to happen every year because of climate change. So that was 2018. 2018 was also the year when investors started to figure out that there was a cost associated with climate change, and some big pension funds are refusing to invest in fossil fuels for that reason. Business in the United States, they tallied up how much that they had to carry in terms of insurance costs as a result of climate damage related to climate change. $100 billion a year of losses just last year in the United States was associated with weather disasters attributed to climate change in 1 year. So business is starting to wake up to the cost of this, and they're starting to make changes too, which in our estimation means that they're more likely to take that sustainability route, right, rather than the others. The final thing that I'll mention about 2018 and why we think it's a watershed year and why it's more likely that we're going to see the sustainability scenario rather than some of the others is that 2018 was the year in October when what they call the International Panel on Climate Change, this is all the world's global climate scientists, they released their latest report on climate change, and as many of you probably know, their main conclusion was that we have 12 years left to avoid a climate catastrophe. Those kind of conclusions are sinking into the heads of citizens in other jurisdictions who vote, sinking into the heads of policymakers, sinking into the heads of leaders. So for us to say, drill baby drill, we're just gonna keep pumping this stuff out, we can say that here in Alberta, but the question is, will there be people ready to buy our product, okay? So here's the diagnosis. It's a long way of getting to the diagnosis. So if we're diagnosing what's really ailing our economy, the US fracking boom has changed the fundamentals of global oil and gas markets. The global supply-demand balance has been transformed. The world is now awash with oil. You remember, we used to think we were going to run out of this stuff. Like the saying goes, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. That's what it's going to be like with oil. Prices in this new environment will be lower, not just for longer, but probably forever. As a result, investment will remain sluggish in the industry that has driven our prosperity for so much longer, for so many years. But it gets worse. Companies are responding by cutting jobs and cutting costs. They've learned how to produce more with fewer people. And finally, the world is moving away from fossil fuels, and it's not going to happen next year. It's not going to happen next decade, as we saw even on the sustainability scenario. The world's still going to be using 70 million barrels of oil a day, and that does mean that we can still keep pumping this stuff. And I want to emphasize that because oil wells deplete very quickly, and so we have to, in order to keep even supplying the world even at that lower level, we still have to keep producing it. So it's not as if the oil industry is going to end just like that. It won't. But the opportunities for growth and expansion will be limited. So, and in terms of in the context of the election, it's important to point out that none of this is the result of government policy, whether from Alberta or the federal government. It's all about global trends, which we can't control, but we in the labor movement argue we need to adapt to. So instead of denying change, it would be irresponsible from our perspective to not have a plan to adapt to it. So what's the prescription? Well, we in the labor movement, we got together over the last 6 or 7 months through our political action committee, which is actually chaired by your president, Heather Smith. And we talked about what is the proper course of treatment for what ails our economy. And we came up with a blueprint, which we are putting in front of the parties and challenge. And this is about a blueprint about maintaining our prosperity in a changing world. How do we do that? It's 12 points. I am not going to go through all 12 points, but I'm going to talk about 5 as quickly as I can, okay? So the first suggestion from the labor movement on behalf of all Alberta workers, including those who work in the oil and gas sector, the first thing that we should do from our perspective is to support our existing oil and gas industry. Now that may seem a little counterintuitive based on what I just said, but in the short term, the reality is that the American market is saturated in a way it's never been before, so we do have to find alternative markets. The only growth market for oil and gas right now is Asia. So when people say we need to get a pipeline to Tidewater, they're right. And that's something that should be done in the near term. But the second thing that we say should be done to support oil and gas is the thing that's not being said by other players on the political stage here in Alberta. And that is to incentivize and support the greening of our industry. And interestingly, this is exactly what the oil and gas, the big oil sands companies are trying to do. So if you ever heard someone like Steve Williams, who's the CEO of Suncor, if you ever heard him interviewed, he will say, and he says it over and over again, he says we need to be, in order to be competitive in this changing world, we need to be cost competitive, and we know what he means by that, but we also need to be carbon competitive. And what he means by that is that the world is moving away from fossil fuels, jurisdictions are adopting carbon pricing and other measures aimed at reducing emissions, so the standards are becoming more stringent related to environmental standards in the markets that we're selling into. This is even true for the United States, even under Donald Trump, because while he doesn't have national policies like Obama had, the big markets in the United States like California, they've introduced carbon pricing, New York introduced carbon pricing, and even China has introduced a carbon pricing system. They're one of those 75 countries. So the world is moving to say, we will use oil, but we have higher standards. So what Steve Williams, the CEO of Suncor, is saying, in order to compete in that world where standards are getting higher, we need to get greener. And so his priority is to get carbon out of the barrel as much as possible, reduce emissions. And this is particularly important given that we sell heavy oil, right? And there's actually an opportunity here. Heavy oil is a little bit, it has a higher emission profile than light sweet crude oil, but the world consumes it differently. And there's actually a different market for heavy oil. About 10% of global demand is heavy oil, so 10 million barrels a day. And it goes to specific refineries that are tooled only for heavy oil. And that has been a constraint for us because we can only sell to a small minority of the refineries in the world. But it's also an opportunity because these refineries are tooled for our product and it's very expensive to retool them. So they'll probably continue using our oil as long as those refineries run. In that market, in the heavy oil market, we're competing not against everyone, we're competing against Venezuela, Mexico, Nigeria, and some from Saudi Arabia. And the good news, if there is that none of them have done anything to green their product. And so when we're racing to be the greenest oil producer, we actually are the head start, and we've actually been supported by current government policies. And I'll get to that in a minute. But the goal for us in the labor movement, for Alberta workers, is to ensure that Alberta is the last heavy oil producer standing in an increasingly carbon-constrained world. And we do that by supporting environmental policies, not because, partly because we're concerned about the future of the planet, we're concerned about climate change, but by greening our product, we actually save our industry in an increasingly, so when someone tells you that environmental policies are bad for our oil and gas economy, we in the labor movement argue the opposite. It's the only way that we can keep our business running in an increasingly carbon-constrained world. And then finally, we want to make sure that we use the wealth generated by this existing industry while we have it for the next 50, 60 years to generate enough revenue to help build a bridge to a greener economy. So that leads to the second point that we want to make in our wish list, is that we need to diversify the economy. This is something that people in Alberta have been talking about for a very long time. Peter Lougheed did it back in the 80s. He did invest in diversification, but his successors basically, they did nothing. If they talked about diversification, it was by nothing more than political rhetoric. And so what we feel is that we need to diversify within the oil and gas sector by what we call pivoting towards the downstream. So that's refining, petrochemicals, partial upgrading, adding value to resources, and instead of exporting a raw product, adding value, keep creating jobs here, and then exporting a value-added product. That's what Peter Lougheed did in the 80s. We stopped doing that for like 30 years, and we need to start doing that again. But in addition to diversifying within oil and gas, we need to diversify beyond oil and gas. So those are the two main points that we in the labor movement think that governments here in Alberta have to capitalize on and focus on going forward. Now, I've already gone way over, so I'm not going to go over the final couple of points. Maybe you can ask me questions and I'll tell you what the other 3 points I was going to make. Do you want me to keep going?
Yes.
Okay, so the point is that we're living in a changing world. Our future is going to be defined by change, and we need to prepare for change by leading change. So we have to change within our own oil and gas sector by reducing our emissions and pivoting towards the downstream in order for that oil and gas sector to be to be prosperous and profitable in the future. So the third point that we think needs to be made by any future government in Alberta, if we want to weather this change that's bearing down on us like a freight train, we have to do other things to make our economy strong and resilient. And this is both within the oil and gas sector but beyond it. Okay, so what do we need to do as a society and as an economy to make ourselves resilient in the face of change? Well, the first thing is that we need to invest in infrastructure. The record from around the world is clear. Jurisdictions that invest in infrastructure thrive. Those that don't. So if you want a modern, functioning economy, then you have to put your money where your mouth is. You have to invest in schools and hospitals. You need to invest in roads and bridges. You need to invest in airports and ports. This is the kind of stuff that is a win-win scenario for workers and business, especially when the economy is struggling, as it was here in Alberta after the price of oil collapsed. When you build infrastructure, you can provide jobs to those construction workers who've lost their jobs in industrial construction and put them to work on building public infrastructure. So it's a win for the workers, but it's also a win for businesses, because when you have modern roads and you have modern infrastructure, then it makes your businesses more competitive and more productive. And so when you invest in these kind of projects, you're building resilience by building infrastructure. Okay. The third point, and this is once again related to making our economy and our people as resilient as possible in the face of change, is that we desperately have to invest in people. Because when the economy becomes challenged, it becomes challenging for individuals. And so any government that's elected in a jurisdiction like ours that's facing change has to support programs and spending that make it easier for individuals to make it through what could be tougher times. How do we do that? We do it by investing in public services. High quality public services aren't just good for individuals, they're good for the economy. And some of this is obvious. If you want a strong economy, you have to invest in education and training. You have to invest in healthcare, so you need a well-educated population to have the highest quality workforce. You need a healthy workforce, but you also need to consider investing in new services that make life more affordable for individuals. Because if it's going to get tougher for individuals and families, one of the roles of government should be to take some burdens off your shoulder. So that's why we say that it makes sense when you're facing change to invest in things that will make it easier for people to manage change. Things like pharmacare, expanding the Medicare umbrella to cover pharmacare, dental care, long-term care, things that so people don't have to pay that all out of pocket themselves. Child care, so we can get more people into the workforce, and maybe even free tuition. These things are not things that you only have when you're rich, right? When oil is $120 a barrel. We would argue that these things are actually even more important when the price of oil has collapsed and we're trying to pull together as a society to deal with change. And of course, in order to pay for these things, we need a fair tax system, right? So we need revenue reform to support quality services. And the final point that I'm going to make, this is from our list of the 12 points that the labor movement thinks Alberta should take in order to be prepared for change, has to do with protecting workers' rights. Well, people would say, what does labor law or employment law have to do with preparing for economic change? And the answer is that workers' rights are an economic issue. And they're an economic issue because 60% of our economy is driven by consumer spending. And if wages and benefits are suppressed by laws that reduce the minimum wage or make it harder for people to join unions or bargain collectively, if that happens, then the economy suffers. So if governments are concerned about the economy, as we should be in our province right now, then they need to enhance, not erode, workers' rights, and they need to enhance, not erode, worker bargaining power so that we make sure that that 60% of the economy continues to be driven by people who are well paid, fairly compensated, and have some kind of security in their lives. So what that means is that we do need a minimum wage that's a living wage. We do need employment standards that protect the rights of people at work. We do need health and safety rules that keep people safe. And we do need union rights that make sure that workers across both the public and private sector have bargaining power so they can get a fair share of the pie. And once they do, that generates consumer spending and keeps the economy moving forward. The final thing I'll mention about the importance of protecting worker rights has to do with public policy. And I think if there's any union in the province that understands this, it's UNA. When you have a strong labor movement, not only do you have more power at the bargaining table, but you also have more power in the political arena. And so when you have power in the political arena, when you have influence, you can put issues on the table that wouldn't have otherwise been there. So pharmacare, child care, protecting public health care. If we don't have a strong labor movement, it's harder to put those issues on the table. And all you have to do is look south of the border, where we had decades of anti-union labor laws passed in state after state after state at the federal level, weaken the power of unions to the point where less than 10% of Americans are members of unions right now. I don't know if you knew that. 10% of the population are covered by union contracts. And that's been bad for American workers in terms of their wages and their livelihoods, but it's been really bad for all working people, union and non-union, because the worker voice has been basically eliminated from public discussion. So if you take polls in the United States, their values, American values are very much like ours. They want public health care. They want workplace health and safety. They want child care. They want well-funded public services. It doesn't happen because they don't have power to make it happen. So when you weaken unions, you weaken the ability to advance on public policy issues that actually matter to ordinary working people. And that's a policy issue, but it's also an economic issue. Because a fairer economy is also a more resilient economy. And I want to stress that word resilience. We need to be resilient in the face of change, and we will be more resilient if we live in a fairer economy characterized by fair labor laws. Okay, so how do the parties compare on this diagnosis? Well, do they get it? And I'll be the first to admit that none of the parties and none of the party leaders have ever said anything like I just said today, including Rachel Notley. But having said that, I've had conversations with Premier Notley about this, and she tacitly, which means sort of by implication, she acknowledges that the energy transformation is happening. She understands that we're being buffeted by global forces. She accepts climate science, and she is implementing a plan for diversification. And I'll get to that in a second. Jason Kenney, on the other hand, denies that anything has changed in the oil and gas markets. He blames everything on Rachel and Justin and environmentalists. You've heard this talk about, foreign-funded environmentalists, right? Which is like, something right out of Fox News. And he denies climate scientists. He actually has people in his caucus who say that, just like Trump, that climate change is a Chinese hoax. No, literally. Like his MLA from Medicine Hat, Drew Barnes, has said that. And then Jason Kenney has no plans for diversification. He says that tax breaks and budget cuts will bring back the good old days. And how do the parties compare on our prescriptions? So we laid out our prescriptions, and how do they compare on support for oil and gas? Well, the good news is that we've got the Notley government that is trying to get a pipeline built. That was one of our first priorities. To be fair, Jason Kenney is saying that that's his priority too. The difference between Rachel and Jason is that she tries to win people over with diplomacy. He says he'll go to war with his enemies. That's one of his platform planks, is a war room. I'm not exactly sure who he's going to go to war with. Albertans, yes. And Rachel, she has been supporting efforts to green the oil and gas industry as a competitive strategy. So you guys remember a couple of years ago when she announced the climate leadership plan, including the carbon tax, she got up on the stage to announce it. Who was next to her? the CEOs of all the big oil sands companies. Why were they there? Because they wanted to become carbon competitive. And the climate leadership plan, through the carbon tax, I don't know, a lot of people realize this, and I don't know why the government doesn't publicize this, but the revenue raised by the carbon tax, part of it goes back to Albertans in the forms of rebates, as everyone knows. But a very big chunk of it actually goes to the oil companies. It goes into an innovation fund that funds innovation aimed at reducing their emissions. And they've been using that money to dramatically reduce per barrel emissions from the oil sands. There's been a huge drop as a result of that innovation over the last 2 years. So she's been supporting that with our carbon tax money. And she has talked about using our existing industry as a bridge to a greener future, and we've seen it because they're investing in things like renewable energy. So diversifying the economy, that's the second thing that we said that we need to do. Rachel Notley has a plan to diversify within oil and gas, and she is pivoting towards the downstream. I had the honor of actually being the co-chair along with an industry person. That never happened in Alberta. We had a labor co-chair and an oil industry person, and we worked together consulting with oil and gas companies around 16 months. I was meeting with oil and gas companies, and we came up with this plan to invest in petrochemicals, refining, upgrading. That's happening right now. It's being implemented. They passed legislation. They set money aside. They've used money, public money, to leverage $12.5 billion of investment announced in downstream diversification just this year. So that's already created thousands of jobs and will create thousands more going forward. So she has a plan for diversifying within oil and gas and even beyond oil and gas. Alberta is now one of the hottest jurisdictions in all of North America for investment in renewable energy. And that portion of her diversification plan has already created more than 5,000 jobs, and there's more to come if it lasts, right? So I would argue that based on what we've seen here, she's the true heir of Peter Lougheed, even though she's not a conservative. But she's continuing the work that he started in the 80s with his diversification plans. Jason Kenney, on the other hand, he has no plan for diversifying within oil and gas. He voted against the NDP diversification legislation. He said he might cancel NDP diversification contracts that have already been signed. He has no plan for diversification beyond oil and gas. In fact, he says he's going to cut the carbon tax, which is being used to help fund development in the renewable energy sector. And by the way, we learned from Ontario, where when they supported renewable energy, it was very expensive. Our renewable energy has been developed through a market mechanism. They put out auctions, the bids for people to bid, and they chose the lowest bidders. The electricity that's been developed, that's being produced by renewable energy in Alberta, is literally the cheapest energy on the continent. On the continent. So don't let anyone tell you that renewable energy is more expensive. It's going to drive up your bills. And it actually hasn't. The cost of electric power has gone down since they started doing this stuff. And then in terms of diversification, the final point that I'll make about Jason Kenney is that his will be a government characterized by budget cuts and tax cuts. And if you cut tax revenue and if you cut budgets, you won't have the money to support diversification. In terms of infrastructure, it's the same situation. She's invested in infrastructure. He's talking about tax cuts and budget cuts. Same thing. If you don't raise tax revenue, if you cut the revenue coming from corporations and wealthy people, it means that you have less money to pay for infrastructure. Same story with investing in people. One of the real outstanding things about the NDP was that in the face of a recession, and it was a brutal recession in 2015 and 2016, she didn't respond the way previous governments in Alberta have always responded, which is by cutting, right? Because when you cut in the face of a recession, that doesn't end the recession, it makes it last longer. Because when you lay off, when you lay off a nurse or a teacher, that doesn't bring back a job that's been lost by a pipe fitter or an electrician. It just means you have more unemployed people. And so the record about austerity, budget cuts in the face of a recession, it's clear from around the world. This approach of cutting in the face of a recession makes things worse, not better. She learned that lesson, and one of the great things untold stories about Alberta is that recession was brutal. By the numbers, it was one of the worst recessions that we've had in our province, at least since the 80s. But the pain of it was largely restricted to the oil and gas sector. Employment in virtually every other sector of the economy outside of oil and gas remained almost the same. Okay, so in the public sector, other private sector portions of the economy, by not engaging in austerity, she built a wall around the industry that was most affected. And they kept the pain from spreading to the rest of us, and it worked. Jason Kenney, on the other hand, he promises austerity even if we're not in recession. So he just wants to balance the budget very quickly, and he's going to do that, and he said that he's going to cut spending by as much as 20%. He wants us to spend on a per capita basis the lowest in the country. I know he signed his health care guarantee promising that he would support public health care. But if you read it, it's full of slippery language. He said he would maintain spending, but he didn't say if it was on the public or private sector. He opened the door to privatization, and he certainly didn't say anything about increasing spending to keep up with population growth and inflation. And so if we elect Jason Kenney, there'll be cuts. It'll compound if another recession comes, and it may, because the price of oil is falling again. Imagine another recession now with another conservative in charge. That would be, we've seen that movie, and it's a horror story. The final thing that is on our wish list is protecting workers' rights, and I don't think I have to explain. If protecting workers' rights is a necessary step in order to shore up our economy by shoring up consumer spending, then Jason Kenney will move us in the opposite direction. He's told us that he's going to freeze the minimum wage. He's going to introduce a lower minimum wage for young workers and the disabled. He's going to roll back all NDP legislation. He says that if he's elected, this coming summer will be the summer of repeal. That's what he called it. So he's going to get rid of the changes that were made, that we worked with this government to reform the Labor Code, the Employment Standards Code, the Occupational Health and Safety Code, the Workers' Compensation Act. We have some of the best legislation in the province on all those fronts right now, in the country on all those fronts right now, and he's going to repeal all of it. He calls these protections costly red tape. Be careful about that. Red tape is a great right-wing buzzword, because who wants to be tied up in red tape? But red tape are actually rules designed to protect people. So when they'll never tell you what they mean by cutting red tape, because if you actually dig into it, people will realize that you're talking about protections for consumers, protections for the environment, protections for workers. So whenever you hear them talking about red tape reform, your antenna should go up. The final two things I'll say about the UCP on workers' rights has to do with positions that they took at their policy convention last May. So they passed resolutions to rescind public sector defined benefit pensions. Okay, they think that all public sector workers are fat cats, and they don't acknowledge that you actually pay for your own pension, and that it's just a mechanism for saving for your own retirement. They think it's some kind of golden handshake, right? They obviously need to look at one of your pay stubs, right, to see how much you pay every month for that pension plan. We, under the NDP, we've been able to get the pension plans out of statute, and so they're independent, but they've passed this legislation, and legislatures are supreme in a parliamentary system. It would be a big fight, but they could pass legislation rescinding the independence of our plans. They could go after our plans. We would fight them like hell in court, and now that we have independence, we're confident that we would win, but they could still do it, okay? The final thing I'll mention in terms of their policy resolutions has to do with labor law. They said that if elected, they would introduce American-style right-to-work laws. Right-to-work laws have nothing to do with rights, and they have nothing to do with work. They're simply a mechanism designed to weaken unions and their ability to represent working people. So basically what they say is that, and they're like, I think it's 27 American states have right-to-work laws now, and they were designed to weaken the labor movement, and they worked. And it works like this. They say, workers should be free to decide whether or not they pay union dues or not. So even if you're covered by a collective agreement, you get the benefits of a collective agreement. Right to work laws say you don't have to pay, it's voluntary to pay union dues. So if you got a benefit and you had a choice about whether to pay for that benefit or not, what would you do? Lots of people just choose, actually you'd be surprised, there's actually quite a few people, like teachers in the United States, in these American states, they understand that a strong union benefits them, so they actually get, and nurses too, they've been able to get a lot of people to pay. But in other sectors, you know, the dues payment is collapsed, and when the dues payment is collapsed, the union can't function, right? They barely hang on. And this is designed to weaken the political power of unions. That's full stop. Designed to weaken our influence on the political stage. And they passed that resolution for that reason. They'll say it's about freedom of choice, but it's about silencing the voice of working people. Okay, and that's on their books as a policy. So conclusions. What Alberta needs is a government. In the face of this change, we need a government with a plan to manage change and to diversify the economy. Rachel Notley acknowledges that change is coming and that we have to prepare for it. Jason Kenney denies change is coming and will leave us unprepared and vulnerable. Kenny's plan for spending cuts and service cuts will weaken us just when we need to be strong. Kenny's lack of a plan for diversification will leave us exposed and vulnerable. Kenny's toolbox will hurt us, not help us, whereas the New Democrat approach will build resilience. And finally, on the economy, which is where we started, because of all the things I've just talked about, Jason Kenney and the UCP are literally the last things we need as we face this mountain of change that's heading towards us. So thank you very much.